All right, we should be ready to start.
Cool. So we've got review release blockers for 1.22. I'm not sure who added these first two. There is basically 5 of them. Sorry, I don't have anyone sharing the screen. 3 of them are about enabling tests. So we should probably just divide and conquer on those. One of them is a very subtle issue in Envoy about Delta XDS that me and Keith have been debugging. So that one has full ownership and attention. And then it looks like the last one is about a regression to Gateway API putting a bunch of random flags that we already have a fix in progress. So I think we just need people to get the test rolling on Istio.io. So if someone is looking for something to do, then picking up one of those would be good. I'm not sure on those if they're just testing issues or actual bugs in Istio, so it's not clear how easy those will be to fix, but thank you for whoever's sharing. Keith, thanks. But yeah, it looks like those need assignees. So for those that aren't aware, the 1.22 code freeze is on Monday, and we'll do the official release 3 weeks later. So we're kind of getting to a point where we need to get these resolved as soon as possible.
That's feature freeze, not code freeze, right?
Well, the official release is in like 3 weeks plus a couple days. So we have to have these done by then. The code freeze is Monday, or the branch cut.
Okay, so we can still you can backport tests and bugs.
Oh yeah, all this stuff can be done over the next 3 weeks, but obviously the earlier is better.
Okay, gotcha. So there are a couple other things that I added milestones. I added to the 1.22 milestone, but aren't here in the card. Let me. I don't know how to get them in card form, or that we even have that board. That's pretty cool. But if we go to, I go to issues and then milestones here. Yeah, so the XCS removal, that's still some of the stuff that we're with the flake. I think that's the same issue. And then we're trying to also get validating admission policy and then the potentially the one-to-many path templating support in as well in 122. I think in those last two are just in need of reviews right now and iterating on them. So if folks have cycles to review, I think that'll be appreciated. But other than that,
Okay,
yeah, I think
let's save like 10 minutes at the end of this call to talk about the OTC one. I don't know necessarily what we need to talk about, but probably save some time doing it synchronously.
sounds good.
I know Jackie's not here, but I don't. Maybe she'll be able to join later, or we can talk without her. That's fine. I don't think there's anything controversial. I just want to go over it. It's also a fairly important change that has been under discussion for 5 years, so people may have formed opinions in those 5 years on how it should or shouldn't be done.
Yeah, fair enough. I can see if she can join in the meantime. Cool. Anybody else have anything to add on the 122 review blockers priorities, or anybody want to sign up to own some of these tests? I think that would be ideal.
I think the ops getting started is mostly broken by work that I had done, so I had been planning to try and resolve that one.
Okay, you cool if I go ahead and assign you then, Ian?
Yeah, that sounds good. And if I can't get to it, I'll unassign and let people know.
All right, thank you. Need change neat reviews. All right, I think that's pretty good. If folks have, well, actually, John, you want to go ahead and sign you and me up for this MTLS test? I think this is the same one as the
I doubt that's the same. Is it really? I think that's about some merging change that was complicated. I mean, ours is like an obscure flake, so.
Well, remember, there's also the XDS removal one for my my follow-up on YPR.
All right, well, yeah, let's look into it. We'll follow up. We can go on that one.
All right, I'll sign me up, and then I think they're related. Cool. I think that's most everything then. Is this your item, John?
No, it's actually not. I don't have any items.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know who added that one.
Okay. Well, I think we're done with this first one. Does anybody want to talk about contrib extensions?
I don't know. It's tricky.
Yeah. I don't have any context for this, unfortunately.
Well, I can provide the background at least. I mean, Envoy ships with a very large number of extensions. We use some subset of that for core Istio, but then there's the arbitrary plugging in that you can do with Envoy filter, or even with custom control planes that some people may develop or run. They use those other ones. So the question is, what do we include in our build? And today, the answer is most core extensions and a few contrib extensions. But it's not very precise, and it's also not maybe exactly what we want. So how Envoy does it is they have this concept of contrib and things that are not, I don't know exactly the criteria to be in one or the other, but some sense of not fully supported or tested or owned or committed to by the community or in contrib. And they have kind of two builds. So for us, we need to decide what do we include in our build, or do we even have multiple builds potentially, or how does that work? I think it's the ask here.
So if we don't include this in our build, the way for users to make use of it with Istio is first to build their own version of Envoy that does include it, and then to modify their injection templates to use that version of Envoy. Is that?
Yes, but like the modifying the injection template is not as hacky as I feel like you may be making it sound. I don't know if that was intentional or not. Like it's just a setting on install what repo to use, right?
Okay, so it's relatively feasible and not terribly high friction.
Yeah, I mean, building Envoy is kind of a huge pain.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's not just Envoy. You have to build your own Istio proxy as well. So you have to kind of reference your own SHA to Envoy contrib builds. Like you have to build the Istio proxy, not just Envoy, which is the same process, but it's just specific. And if you don't have Envoy experience, the Istio approach can be a bit daunting.
To be fair, if you're using these custom extensions, you probably ought to have Envoy experience because it's pretty low level. You're now outside of the Istio box, but it is still a pain even for me, for example. So
I don't know anything about generic proxy extensions or what they're particularly asking for, but as a rule, this sounds a lot like we've made hard things possible, right? Like that's some of the objective. If this is a really complicated and niche config, I don't know that it should be especially easy to do. That sounds like what did the solo team call it? I don't know if it was Ian or Ben. Foot guns, right?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. We made it. It says shooting yourself in the foot super easy. I don't think it's as simple as it sounds. I mean, it's also you have to use Envoy filters to enable them, and then if you use Envoy filters, you are doomed if Envoy makes any change. We had one open bug actually that I want to maybe raise awareness of related with this. There is a persistent session stuff that was added in Envoy, and then 2 releases ago it was broken, and we noticed when someone tried to upgrade, there are only few users, and it got fixed finally in 1.22. But again, 3 versions don't have it working, and that's a something that is not contrib, it's really a normal extension. And we have pretty much no way to detect many of those changes properly, and you know, so I think we should take a much more strict stake about, you know, what Istio project supports, which is the officially supported and stable Envoy features, and try to actively prevent users from using stuff that is you know, not stable in Envoy. By the way,
So that's a very interesting stance, though, because you just said not stable in Envoy. So isn't the like stateful set, or not stateful, whatever, the stateful thing, that is in core Envoy?
it is in core Envoy, but it's not stable. Yes.
Oh, it's not considered stable in Envoy?
I mean, many things in Envoy, including some things we use in our stuff, it's on the Envoy page is not declared as stable. You know, they have that thing where they say that is not ready for production yet.
Oh yeah, I thought it was. Sorry. Okay.
I mean, even in Istio, we use some that are not yet. I mean, some of them are not even in Envoy, are in our fork, which again. But we need to be careful, especially if we want to allow in ambient with arbitrary waypoints. I mean, if you're allowed to plug nginx as a waypoint, of course you can plug any Envoy versions that you want, and it's going to become very easy. But with classic Istio, it's super dangerous. That's my point.
So my 2 cents is if the PR creator intends to add new features using the generic proxy extension, I think it's necessary to build with this filter support. But if the plan is to just use this generic proxy in their proprietary builds, but not adding new features to Istio, then probably they should create their own branch to do that instead of adding to the public Istio branch.
Yeah, it should be a fork. Is that
Yeah.
that's what you're saying?
Yes, that's my, yeah. But we don't know. So I asked the question, what's the plan for this?
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement there. Like if the usage of something is, and John, you're asking for like a policy, I think maybe a tentative one that's kind of just my intuition at this point is if the only way to use the Envoy feature is via Envoy filter, then it's probably not something that we want to enable. Like kind of what Costin is saying, like if they want to turn something on in Istio, it should ideally be a proper API. And there's some, there's some quote unquote debt that we have in Istio when it comes to like stateful sessions, rate limiting, things like that. That granted, those were in core Envoy, but those could really use proper APIs. But if they're trying to, the user needs to enable something that is not in core Envoy, that requires more work in the build process, and the only way for them to use it is Envoy filter, that's a pretty good sign that it probably doesn't belong in there, in my opinion. What do others think, policy-wise?
It's tricky because in my mind, what you said makes sense, but then I think about like if we were to go and take like the OAuth filter or the rate limit filter and remove those, then we would have a lot of unhappy people. We could say that we grandfather all the existing ones in and we just don't add new ones, but we keep everything that's in there. But then, I don't know, we're kind of frozen in how useful Istio is.
I think, John, we are saying that if it has a proper Istio API, we do whatever is necessary to make the API work, including forking Envoy like we do. I mean, extending Envoy with our own stuff and doing whatever is necessary. If it's an alpha, we take responsibility for it because it's a V1 API that we are committed to. If they break it in Envoy, we fork the filter or do whatever we need to do.
Right, but like if I don't think it would be good for the project if we went and broke rate limiting in the next release, for example, even though there's no proper API for it, right?
Again, case by case, and the proper solution for rate limiting is to create a proper API and to create a proper, you know, especially with that works with you know, gateway and all the other stuff.
I agree. It's just like, how do we have a, I guess, like the request from was to create a policy, which I actually agree with because we've had this discussion a lot, and I'd love to just have a final stance instead of discussing it each time. Like, what makes rate limiting valid but generic proxy not, for example?
Existing users. And I think maybe
So it's the grandfathering, basically.
No. John, I think if generic filtering is necessary and you have a, you know, proper design with all the implication, you know, what is a security posture and what is the API and everything else, that's a valid thing to add as a proposed new API, I mean, including support, etc.
No, I'm talking about things that don't have APIs. So I get that if there's an API and we add it, then obviously we need a filter. That's it. This is for things that don't have APIs and maybe won't have APIs. Right.
If they don't have APIs, then they are what, features? Then they have a feature description and feature documentation and support and all the other stuff. And everything that we do should have some sort of, you know, understanding about what are the implication and what it does and why we are doing it.
Right, but long ago we opened up the door to arbitrary Envoy usage through Envoy filter, right?
But we also said that it's not going to be ever V1 and that we are going to prevent in some deployments use of non-V1, non-stable APIs and so forth. I mean, it's kind of Envoy filter. It's not something that is officially supported by Istio project, as far as I know.
Right, but do you, like, I guess I'm not sure what you're proposing. Are you saying that we should go and remove all the stuff that's not part of core APIs? Or just we shouldn't add more?
Start with not adding more, and then gradually, yes, we should prevent user from using it and you know, keep it in one of the channels that we discussed or whatever we are going to do. I mean, validation, I don't know what is the discussion, the conclusion of that discussion about how we prevent users from using unsafe stuff. I thought we agreed on that, no?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree. Let's not remove what we already have with rate limiting and external auth. For this particular case, I mean, we have one person asking, right? Because you look in the past, rate limiting and external auth, we had many people asking. That's why they were added. They don't have a proper API, but I don't think we can take them out easily. So I would say it's case by case, and you know, keep what we have, and until they are graduated to a proper API someday, hopefully.
Yeah, I think it's an okay concept, and in our case, I think a necessary concept at times to effectively declare bankruptcy on some of the technical debt when it comes to processes. Like I think that to get to a point where we have a policy, where we have a way that we want to do things, the policy that we create shouldn't be, in my opinion, shouldn't be constrained by what already exists. I think those are two separate questions, and so I think starting from the ideal policy that we want and then figuring out a way to, if we can make it consistent with what we have today, that's great. If we can't make it consistent with what we have today, then, you know, we can either carve out an exception to the policy. So for example, there has to be proper API proposed with it, but an exception is to get unanimous COC approval as a way around it. I think that's also valid. Or we can grandfather existing things in. And I think both of those move us to a strictly better place. And in the meantime, you know, what I hope to be able to, you know, have the community prioritize at some point in the future is, you know, iterating on proper APIs for the things we mentioned, OAuth and rate limiting, especially. I think that you know, helps us, and when we get to that point, we won't need the exceptions as much anymore. So I think it's a decent step to move us forward, even if we can't jump to where we want to be immediately.
So, oop, sorry, mic issues. So it sounds like we're starting consensus on something along the lines of new extensions are not added unless they're part of core APIs. And then there's some debate on whether we grandfather in all the existing extensions or we kind of go through it all and kind of decide on a case-by-case basis. I, at the very least, would like to keep them all for a little bit because Istio 1.22 is going to be a ginormous release. So if we're going to break things, let's spread out the breakage. And then some nice follow-ups would be maybe better documentation and tooling about building custom builds for people that do have to do this. Right now, it's pretty tricky. And then promoting some of the more common things out to core so that people don't have to do this, like OAuth, rate limiting, and other things. Does that sound fair, accurate? And in the short term, that means this PR specifically, we will not accept it.
Yeah, that sounds right to me.
Yeah, agreed. With the caveat that we won't accept the current PR as is. If the person submitting the PR can come with, solid use cases, API proposals, and multiple people interested in it, then I'm willing to take a look. But as is, I agree. It's a no accept.
Okay. I also added another to-do to actually document this policy somewhere, so we don't have this conversation in a month and forget we talked about it. All right. Shall we move on? One here. Yes, you are. Next up is DNS auto allocation.
All right. Actually, I'm working on a PR for displaying the auto allocated IP address in the service center resource. But John gave me comments on there, like there is a lot of trade-offs. So I would like to get multiple thoughts or ideas around there. Basically, I'm not. I'm fine for any places to display the IP auto allocated IP address. Like currently, the PR choose that status field for the place to display it, but I think annotation or the other places, it would be better. Yeah, fine.
Yeah, I can give some more context on why I mentioned that this is worthy of a lot of discussion. So I've had an issue with the, oh, sorry, I didn't realize there was hands. Well, I guess I'll keep going. With the auto allocation for a while due to how it's implemented and the reliability of it or lack thereof. So for those that are not familiar, in Kubernetes service, there is also auto allocation of IPs, right? And how that works is that the API server, when you create a service object, it inserts an IP address that it allocates for you into the object, and it has some logic in the API server that makes sure that it never gives out duplicate IPs, basically. This is very nice, I think. What we do in Istio, however, is if there's no IP assigned manually by the user, we leave it empty, and internal to IstioD, we allocate one. Now, that allocation is local to that specific binary. So if you have 10 binaries running at Istio, they may all allocate different IPs. Now, anytime they allocate a different IP, it's a bug, because when a proxy connects to a different control plane, the IP will shift and then you run into all sorts of issues, which is the bug that we've had in every single release and had all sorts of issues with, and have like had 10 different fixes and none of them have really solved all the issues. So it kind of, it's always struck me as a very unreliable mechanism that we have. So what I would want is actually not just reporting what the address is and status for debugging, but actually using this as an opportunity to persist the allocation so that it can be used and shared everywhere and be consistent, basically. One of the problems specifically with status, even ignoring that desire, is that, like I said, two different Istio can have this different IP assigned to the same thing. So that would be somewhat problematic. Now they shouldn't, if they're the same version, they're supposed to have stable allocation. But you could have different revisions with different versions, for example, and then you run into issues there. So then there's the whole question of, okay, if we're going to persist allocations, how do we do that? How do we ensure that, one, we give it an IP address and that IP address is unique, and we didn't accidentally assign the same IP address to 2 different service entries at the same time, and end up with a duplicate. And it's like, when do we write it? Do we do like a webhook and write it at object creation time, or do we have a reconcile loop? And if we have a reconcile loop, how do we make sure that like we don't have an issue at like the first few seconds before we've assigned the IP address, and traffic behaves differently, all sorts of things. So it's a fairly complex problem. Another thing too is that in Kubernetes for service, in older versions, they have like this internal etcd interface to do the IP address allocation. But in newer ones, this is done in standard Kubernetes APIs with this new object called the IP address. So we could actually use the IP address object to make sure we don't have collisions, which would be basically, when there's a service entry created, we create an IP address object. The name of the IP address object is the IP address, so you kind of guarantee that there's no duplicates there, and then use that for the IPAM. The problem is that it's alpha still, so it's not on by default. So I don't know, lots of info, but I feel like there's a lot of problems to solve and things to think about. So I want to make sure we don't do something hastily here and not consider all the options.
Yeah, I think that's a bit more. I mean, I don't disagree with what you're saying, John, but I think my understanding of the proposal and what Ingwan wants to do is to actually do the same thing like service, meaning that not only saves the status that an Istio will assign, but if an IP is already in status, to use it, and presumably also to do it in a with master election and we implement our own IPAM for service entries, consistent with what service is doing, is not particularly original or special in any way. There is a problem with cluster boundaries and all the other stuff, because I believe service entries are still, I don't remember if they're still loaded cross cluster, but I mean, it's certainly better than what Istio is doing right now. And we have these auto allocations that went in without a lot of this review and a lot of consideration for the things that we discussed. But as long as we don't plan to remove the currently broken implementation, we need to improve it somehow, and clearly reflecting the IP and doing everything you described before to make sure we don't have different Istio allocating different addresses. We have proper master. I mean, that things that we can improve eventually, including IP address when it becomes stable. We cannot use it now. Also, we cannot reuse IP address because it's in a different range. We cannot take over the service CIDR for service entries. So I don't know what is alternative. I mean, keep using the current broken stuff. Don't do anything until forever because we keep discussing it, or just make incremental improvements and reflect the IP address and do something that it's better than what we have.
I'm a bit surprised that you're complaining that the original feature went in without much discussion, but now saying that we shouldn't have discussion here and should just go for this approach. Like the alternative is to go just have a proper design doc and take these things into consideration and build the right approach, right? I don't want to just slap on a status field for a broken feature when we could just go spend that effort doing it right.
Okay, then let's kill the existing feature if we know that the feature that is in, which is used by people actually. That's a problem. I mean, there are people who are, even if it's alpha, it's experimental, and we know it's broken, people are enabling it because they read somewhere that it's good in our documentation actually, where we don't say that it's crap. I mean, submit a PR to take it off in next release, and then yes, we can discuss it as long as we want until we get proper implementation.
Why can't we just keep it the way it's been for many years and take the amount of time it needs to do it right? I don't see
Because
why we've had it for many years and now
Mm.
we just want to slap something on instead of, I don't know. It feels
So, John,
odd
is
to
it
me.
something that is safe to use in production or not? If it's safe to use in production, then I think adding the status is not necessarily is consistent with what other things are doing, and it's improving it. If it's unsafe to use in production, then we should not claim that it's safe to use in production in our docs, because that's why people are using it. At least remove
I
it
don't
from the
think it's
docs.
safe to use in production, but people do use it in production. So that's
Because
why I'm
our
so
docs,
motivated to fix it properly.
because our docs, we have a doc in Istio IO that tells people to use it. It says, hey, enable this. Doesn't say anywhere that it's crap and you'll probably have an outage, but it's there in our documentation. Let's at least remove the documentation and make it clear this is not supported, should never be used in production, and then sure, I mean, we can take our time to do it properly, which is, again, probably never, because it's there are many problems really with this feature. We are using a random range that we don't own and so forth.
I would disagree that adding status is a strict improvement. It is an unstable property or characteristic of the resource. And now we are elevating it from implementation detail to something that people can query, people can write automation around. I don't want that kind of implementation detail around. And I agree with John that if in a vacuum, auto allocation gets removed and it doesn't get promoted to V1. It's and we scrap it as a failed experiment and we start over. That's not the reality that we live in. And I don't think that the choice is, so black and white between remove it or absorb all of the debt. There's a such thing as keeping it in status quo, as far as the implementation. And then the beauty of not putting it in status at this point is that we can change implementation without breaking anything user facing. My understanding is the auto allocation is purely implementation detail, using Envoy config for routing things to service, and there's some special logic that understands that these are non-1918 addresses and does some weird stuff with it to route it properly. Assuming that or something like that is the case, we can stabilize that in the background and then do the work to elevate it without changing the fact that this is already an API used by hundreds of users, and without doing anything to push that implementation detail up higher to be used and abused.
So I think there are about 2% of users that are using, I think, at least according to some statistics that we ran, or probably 1%. 2% was all DNS interception. But I'm proposing to fix the documentation. The documentation right now, if you read the doc about how to enable it, doesn't say anything that John just said about how crappy the feature is. It's like all the other documentation. It's, do this and this will happen. Doesn't say anything that your production may go down. Doesn't say anything that security has not been reviewed and just like the other part of the feature. It's just dishonest with the users. I mean, I'm not saying to remove the feature in the next version, but at least fix the documentation. And just like Envoy is saying, if you use this feature, probably it will break and is not reviewed for production we should, at least be honest with the users, because that's why people are using it, because our docs don't make any difference between what is safe to use in production and secure and what is just garbage.
I think that makes sense, and I don't hear any disagreement on that, Carsten.
Okay, I mean, I'm happy as long as we have clear documentation that this feature should not be used in production. If used in production, bad things will happen, but it's your problem, just like Envoy filter. Then we can take steps to block it, at least for production users that we support, and then we don't have a problem.
So just to clarify, does that mean that you don't have an interest in working on improving it?
I think the proper way to improve it is to kill it and to use external DNS or some other mechanisms that to deal with egress IPs. There are fundamental problems for security. That's the reason I'm very interested in this thing, because again, ambient and Istio security are based on secure DNS, because if you have, someone messing with DNS, the entire validation and secure naming is gone. And again, it's something that should be addressed at VPC level, or kind of at the DNS integration level, because what we are doing effectively, we are implementing a split horizon DNS in a hacky way. And split horizon DNS has been around for 20 years, and at least people know what are the security implications. Does it make sense? I mean, you understand the connection with breaking secure naming, and how it impacts ambient and Istio.
That's a general problem with DNS proxying, not with auto allocation, right?
It's actually a problem with taking service entries IP and putting it in DNS. That's a different story. Auto allocation, actually, it's not necessarily bad, but my point is that a proper auto allocation would populate those entries in external DNS, if you're using external DNS, or core DNS, or will be done at a different levels than hacking it with Istio, because this depends on enabling Istio interception, which in turn it's also pretty bad because it doesn't verify DNSSEC. It is not actually secure. It's doing all kind of other things.
But the interesting thing is that if we did it right by putting the IP address in the spec, then you could actually use the auto allocation without the DNS proxy feature if you had a controller that populated service entry IPs into external DNS. So this seems like actually fixing auto allocation would be preferable for your use case of not using DNS proxy.
If we put it in status, then you can extend external DNS or some other controller to populate it in the external VPC DNS, and then we can have a proper use with. I mean, we can use auto allocation without depending on DNS interception.
Right. That's exactly what I want as well. It's just not in the way that's done in the PR, because the way that's done in the PR isn't using it as the source of truth. It's just reporting the internal random assigned thing that can change at any time.
At this point, sorry. I thought NIST for the sure, in terms of a few years, I think I thought the IP address auto allocation logic will be there, but can be enhanced anyway. But I don't think there is a great way to get rid of the entire auto allocation features from the Istio. So the purpose of the PR is actually before going to improve the IP allocation. I mean, not improve, something like fixing the IP allocation logic. I think we can reveal the auto allocated address in the status or some another places. Then it could be the building block for having the stable IP auto allocation logic, I think. But if it is not, please let me know which point is not really great. Because if we already have a broken logic for the allocation, and it is used for creating the invoice configuration. And yeah. So
go ahead.
I'm not sure that what is the risk for revealing the allocated IP address.
There is no means right now, to my understanding. But I think that's a good thing, because it means that people can't depend on it. It means we can change to use a completely made up IP range, and we probably won't break people, except assuming a quick restart. Right? There's not going to be automation. Yeah, you can get it programmatically, but we're not revealing it. My big thing is I don't want to add yet another way to an easy way to surface it programmatically in a controller.
Oh, I was actually agreeing with you, Keith. I was saying that the point here was that, look, this isn't the proper way to do it, but it's nice to have some debuggability. And we do actually have debuggability in known unstable interfaces like registry Z. And it's not, I don't view this as a stepping stone to the right solution. I mean, it could be potentially, but we don't actually know what the right solution is yet. And so we don't know if it's a stepping stone. And I think there's very credible paths to the proper implementation not being anywhere near this and using something like a webhook to do the auto allocation at admission time, for example, to match what Kubernetes is doing with service. So to me, like, it's not, like, maybe this is all useful and maybe we end up doing it eventually, but I think we need to actually design out how auto allocation should work before we go and implement it, instead of kind of blindly going in some direction and then maybe we have to pivot and now it's in status and, you know, is now people depending on that. It's an API. We have all these issues, right? Yeah, I don't want to make a feature that we are all concerned with the stability of even less stable without proper consideration that we're moving in the right direction.
Okay.
Should we make auto allocation field and service entry an extended field?
There is no field. It's just an annotation that you put on an environment variable you put in proxy config that you put in a pod, and that will magically create this thing.
Oh, gotcha.
And if you put in mesh config, you mess up your entire, mesh config proxy, you mess up your entire production. You can only mess up an individual workload by putting it in as a notation on that thing. So it's an environment variable, which by definition, it's not supposed to be, it's supposed to be experimental.
Okay, gotcha. I have other thoughts about how to maybe advance the field, but those can wait. So that's interesting. I didn't realize it was an env var.
So to move forward, Ingon, can you send a PR to the docs, to Istio docs, to actually mark it as, not safe for production, not secure, and do not use unless you want bad things to happen, and then we can continue the discussion, because the first, stop the bleeding is probably the first step we need to do. And I think there is consensus that the documentation should reflect what we really think about the feature. And then we can take it, offline, because there are some other alternatives where we just, use a mutating webhook to, at least for our use case, where we want to, populate the real DNS server instead of real interception.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Yeah. Yeah, we'll make some following up as Kosti mentioned, and yeah, bring it back.
By the way, there is another slight alternative for this. We can have an Istio contrib controller that may create, DNS entry objects. The external DNS object, and basically program a real DNS server based on service entries, which will mean that you don't have to use DNS interception. It's just that the controller will create a split horizon DNS proper, and will have the same effect without allocation, without changing anything in Istio code per se.
Oh, I see.
So basically, use the similar code that Istio D is using, but populate it. Use it to program a a real DNS. I mean, external DNS is a good starting point because it can program pretty much all DNS servers, or we can have one for GCP DNS, and that will achieve the same effect without changing anything in Istio per se, because really the feature is about DNS entries being created for those things.
Okay. Yep. Let's sync up in the offline.
Yeah, I think we can do this separately. I mean, completely independently.
Yep, sure.
All right. Think we have the came to a conclusion on that. So you've got one more topic, John. You wanted to talk through the auth ZPR synchronously?
Yeah, I don't know necessarily what we need to talk about. So what do we need to talk about? Is there anything open, or is it just implementation? I know there's the Envoy issue. Has that been acknowledged, or?
Jackie, are you here? Can you speak to that? Let me see. Jackie's able to make it. I don't know, she was here. I think she left, or had to go somewhere. But the Envoy issue, I think, is actually as expected. The slash is not optional, so you actually have to put the slash in since it refers to a different resource. So I think that's kind of working as intended. That's where I'm trying to go. The open stuff for the auth-z policy issue. Questions around whether or not to beat devalidation on this, and I think that's the main open question. So yeah, John, you mentioned wanting some validation, like validating webhook validation on this. Do you see the responses as far as potential breakage?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what exactly we validate. Like at one point, and this was somewhat what my comment was based on, it was saying if we detect it as a path template, then we do stricter validation. Like, for example, anything with a brace is an illegal URL. So if there's any brace, then I think we can go into a strict mode. Like, yes, technically someone could put a brace in today. We probably don't reject it. We could check, but I'm sure we don't. But it will never ever match. So I don't know. I mean, there's still risk. Like, yeah, someone could have a rule that never matches, and they were fine with that. Now they update, and now they can't modify the rule. I think it's largely acceptable to have validation break rules that are entirely broken. I don't know. It's a bit stretching here. Normally, when we use that logic, it's for things that cause XDS rejects, where it's like actively harmful, not just not doing anything.
Right.
But the likelihood, really, of someone having a brace in their URL match for authorization policy just seems kind of astonishingly low. And the risk of not having validation for authorization policies, where users can accidentally make mistakes using this new feature, is very high. So for me, I would say if we have braces, we do more validation, but it's the trade-off there.
I think that sounds acceptable. Yeah, it's like one of the things where like that, because it's technically a regression, but I think it's an acceptable one, given the risks. Like the only thing I can think of is where somebody has a brace in their auth-z policy today, and it doesn't work. But that's allowed. It's like one of those things where you can't tell that it's broken because it has the desired effect. And then we start validating it, and then there's stuff break. But I guess it's not strictly work because they can't even apply the resource. They should be able to delete it, but they can't apply it. So I think that's actually fine. Okay. Yeah, I think I'm convinced on that. The other thing on auth-z policy is the allowed support. So single star and double star embraces are the only two things being added. the issue that was closed was this pattern. For some reason, the trailing slash was being stripped off. Well, it's being stripped off in Envoy, and so it was causing some non-matches. But I think that's actually acceptable because this rule has the slash in there, and so that slash would need to be present in order for it to match. Since without the slash are technically two different like resources in the URI spec. And outside of that, I think this is just tests plus validation. And I do think there's actually, I remember looking and seeing something in the validation path.
So the 0 aspect of the double stars means what if you have it not at the suffix, like I'll type in the chat.
Let me switch back. I think that will match. I think it should allow both. It just doesn't allow A.
It definitely should not allow A in this case because there has to be a B suffix, right?
Oh, true, duh. But yes, I think that ZR mini. Oh, I see what you're saying. It won't. I don't think it will match. It won't match A/B. I think it would have to match A/B.
Okay, but then slashes, like, don't they get normalized? We should have maybe a pretty extensive doc and make sure that all these have tests for these weird cases. I haven't looked at the tests. I see there is one, but I haven't looked at it because it's newer. But I'm sure there's all sorts of weird cases that people can come up with, and we should just make sure it's clear what they do. Part of security for policies is understanding how they work. So,
yeah, I agree. I think the docs are the right place to handle this for now. And if Envoy happens to have some behavior that creates a ton of friction for users, we can make the changes. I think especially the relationship between normalization and policy makes for some weird-ish behavior. But I think Envoy technically follows the spec in all cases. It just might not be intuitive for users writing their OPSI policies. So, for example, you would need to write, a policy for A/B itself, as well as A with the brackets $B. It's a pretty easy fix too. Fix an array.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't even know how these actually work. So having docs and then test to validate those docs on all these edge cases would be super helpful. Because I also don't trust that Envoy implemented them correctly, not because I don't trust Envoy, but because these are all very subtle and tricky. I mean, not correctly necessarily, but in the way that we document them. So I want to make sure that we're validating those, especially with the normalization stuff.
Yep, Jackie added some tests to Envoy to prove out some of the double star stuff, and that got released in Envoy 130. But I agree we should have some Istio tests as well in the docs to make sure it continues to work. So if Envoy happens to change the implementation, we can catch it. Okay, we're at time. Action items, test plus docs on the edge cases. But outside of that, I think this is ready to review. And we do have some validation tests. So if folks have cycles to review, it would be appreciated. Any last minute topics or things to bring up before we sign off? All right.
Okay. I just want to make sure. Did you discuss the first one, the review the blocker for the next major release?
Yes, we did.
Okay. Because I want to raise it up because I recall there was one issue I created maybe 1 month ago, and since no one care about it, and the cut branch will be start next my week. I just want to it won't be a block. Yeah, it should be the second one. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, folks. Talk to you later.